They are being detained based on made-up accusations following their commitment to Palestinian liberation.
But unfortunately, the reality of modern warfare is that actually you are much more likely to die as a civilian than you are as a soldier, which is actually one of the major reasons why I oppose war overall, is that I think we have crossed the threshold where our weapons are so powerful that we can't even distinguish anymore.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to the Struggle Video News. Greta Thunberg was not on this Global Sumud Flotilla, but this is her comment.
The other day, Israel illegally intercepted over 20 boats, civilian ships of the Global Sumud Flotilla, and violently abducted almost 200 of the participants over 1,000 kilometers away from Gaza. The majority of these were released and dropped off in Crete after many had been so beaten up that they had to be admitted to hospital following a coordination between the Israeli and Greek government. 2 of these still remain detained and were illegally brought to Israel, where it has been confirmed that they are now being tortured. And these people are safe: a Swedish and Spanish citizen with Palestinian papers, and Tiago, a Brazilian citizen. They are being detained based on made-up accusations following their commitment to Palestinian liberation. They have devoted their lives to stand and act in solidarity with Palestine and oppressed people, and they are committed friends, comrades, fathers and sons, and we demand their immediate release. They are being held, imprisoned and tortured alongside thousands of Palestinians who are held without charges and being tortured as well in Israeli prisons. And the Swedish, the Spanish and the Brazilian governments have to act immediately. The international community has to demand their freedom and justice. And alongside this, several of our Tunisian comrades from the Global Sumud Flotilla are also being imprisoned following their activism in solidarity with Palestine in the Global Sumud Flotilla. Free them all.
Israel must immediately and unconditionally release Global Sumud Flotilla members Saif Abu Kishik and Tiago de Avila, who were detained in international waters and brought to Israel, where they continue to be held without charge. It is not a crime to show solidarity and attempt to bring humanitarian aid to the Palestinian population in Gaza, who is in dire need of it. Disturbing accounts of severe mistreatment of Abu Kishik and de Avila must be investigated and those responsible brought to justice. We call for an end to Israel's use of arbitrary detention and of broadly and vaguely defined terrorism legislation, which are inconsistent with international human rights law. Israel must also end its blockade on Gaza and allow and facilitate the entry of humanitarian assistance to the besieged Palestinian Strip in sufficient amounts.
Tiago Avila is one of 2 members of the flotilla that have been detained by Israel. His mother died on May 5th without seeing her son released from custody. A street protest in favor of the flotilla by anti-Zionists in Tel Aviv.
צה"ל על חשש עוד נוציא משט חדש
New testimonies revealed Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya stripped, beaten, and set upon by dogs in Israeli detention. 3 recently released Palestinian prisoners have provided harrowing testimony about the condition of Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya, director of the Kamal Adwan Hospital in northern Gaza, who has been held in Israeli detention since his arrest on December 27, 2024. Released prisoner Ahmad Khadas said he initially did not recognize Abu Safiya due to his physical deterioration. He described the doctor spending most of his time, quote, sitting in a daze, unquote, barely able to speak, while fellow prisoners could hear him screaming during beatings but were powerless to intervene, with those who tried to help facing tear gas raids. A second witness, Hamza Abu Omaira, said Abu Safiya suffered constant vomiting, could not keep food down, and was denied medical care. He described 7 consecutive days during which prisoners were shackled by both hands and feet. He said Abu Safiya was also reportedly forced to repeat degrading phrases about himself under torture. A third released prisoner said he witnessed Abu Safiya being stripped, beaten after interrogation, and attacked by police dogs that, quote, scratched him and knocked him to the ground, unquote. All 3 witnesses warned he faces imminent death if not released immediately. At a birthday party for Israeli minister Ben-Gvir, attended by the top brass of the Israel police and the Israel prison service security, Minister Ben-Gvir was presented by his wife with a cake featuring a golden noose. They were celebrating a law passed by the Israeli Knesset that mandated death by hanging for those convicted of killing with the intent of rejecting the existence of the State of Israel. In other words, the penalty is for Palestinians only. As we record, writer Viet Thanh Nguyen wrote, "If I had an Israeli character in one of my novels celebrate his birthday with a cake with a noose, I'd be called antisemitic." Speaking of anti-Semitism, the only Jewish head of a political party in Britain was recently caricatured in this way. The drawing is being compared to Nazi caricatures of Jews in the 30s. The cartoon, which appeared in the supposedly dignified Times of London, shows Green Party head Zach Polinsky kicking a policeman in the head. The Times objected to a Polanski retweet of a criticism of police. More on that unique protest against the war on Iran atop a Washington, D.C. bridge, courtesy of Democracy Now!
A man who scaled the Frederick Douglass Bridge to protest the war in Iran remained on the bridge overnight and into a 5th consecutive day. Guido Reichstadter, a veteran and father of 2 from Florida, said in a statement, quote, "I'm calling on the people of the United States to bring an immediate end to the Trump regime's illegal war in Iran and the removal of the regime's power through mass, nonviolent, direct action and non-cooperation," unquote.
On May 6th, Guido Reichstadter came down from the bridge and was arrested. He was protesting the war on Iran and the growing danger of AI. Reichstadter was arrested and charged with a crime. The politicians who funded the illegal war on Iran, of course, are free to go. This is Reichstadter, and this is his Twitter feed. Now a bit more about Iran from Democracy Now!
Iran executed 3 men on Sunday in connection with anti-government protests earlier this year. Mehdi Razouli, Mohammad Reza Miri, and Ibrahim Dolatabadi were all hanged in Mashhad. According to Iran Human Rights Monitor, Iran carried out 656 executions in the first 3 months this year. Since March, during the U.S.-Israeli war in Iran, there have been 24 political executions.
Never forget that while the war on Iran is a criminal act of aggression, the regime running Iran is fascist and murderous. And now a portion of the Shafer lecture, which is sponsored by Promoting Enduring Peace. The undocumented immigration activist Ali Wane was the speaker.
I'm really honored to be able to join you in this conversation. I mean, honored on the one hand, and what was kind of exciting about this was it's the first time that I've seen the list of the other speakers, and many of the other speakers are people that, I'm aware of, that I've looked up to or that I've looked to for some kind of direction over the years. So it does feel at least like I'm in good company. And I do also simply want to thank this group for this opportunity to talk about this issue, which feels, incredibly relevant, even though, I'm not gonna lie, I feel a little bit sad today, as I have been feeling for quite a while. Uh, the fact that it is so important to talk about what I called the crisis of mass dehumanization. And actually, before the Zoom, we were talking about whether or not it should be dehumanization single or dehumanization plural. Uh, but certainly the reality is that we are dealing with an era of immense cruelty, and immense cruelty, immense amnesia also, which is extremely dangerous. And before I even get into the bulk of my conversation, I'd like to do something which I sometimes do in my presentations, which is to maybe pause and have 30 seconds worth of silence so that we can sort of on an individual level think about people who have passed, who have inspired you. But also, I think it would be good to spend this 30 seconds to think about just the mounting number of people who are unfortunately being exterminated through this new round of war, this attack on Iran and slash Lebanon, which is just a continuing attack on what's been going on in Palestine as well, and which is really reverberating and expanding everywhere. So if we could just take 30 seconds just to think about the people that you love who have inspired you, who've passed, but also the people who unfortunately recently have been killed by these wars of empire. So I'm just going to take 30 seconds. Okay. Um, so I think I think it's important to take this time to think about the people who came before us, but it's also really important in the context of this conversation to think about um, kind of what goes with this crisis of mass dehumanization, right? And I would say that one of the things that fuels the crisis of mass dehumanization and that makes it more perpetual is simply the fact that living in an empire means that we live in a country that mass produces death, but that does not honor grief. And that is actually one of the things that I believe leads to a lot of, mental health issues in this country, because this country unfortunately produces so much death and so much grief, both domestically and internationally. And yet at the same time, there isn't respect for the time that it needs for human beings to process the harm that is being done by this empire. And I'm going to get into some of the specifics about this crisis in Iran in a little bit. But one of the things that I was thinking about this past week as I was preparing for this thing is just the mounting number of casualties that is already happening in our names right now. So, as of today, if you simply look at the number of casualties in Iran and in Lebanon, because of Israel's sort of parallel attack in Lebanon, we are already at about 2,200 deaths. 2,200 deaths. And if you look at your kind of regular, the regular media channels right now, it's almost unremarked. It is almost unremarked, that level of death. And one of the things that I can tell you about being an anti-war activist, and one of the things that sort of pushed me towards becoming an anti-war activist is when I was doing some research many, many years ago at the beginning of my journey as an activist. I actually found that social scientists have determined that now, because of the power of our weaponry, when you are in a theater of war, it is statistically more likely for you to die if you're a civilian in that theater of war than if you are a soldier. Now, think about this, right? Like, war is, of course, a barbarity, a horror, one of the worst things that human beings can do. But over the many centuries, there has been at least a kind of outline and a framework for quote unquote the rules of war. And a big impetus for that framework, for the creation of that framework, is to separate civilians from combatants. The idea is that, as regrettable as it is that war produces so much death, at the very least, we should try to keep those deaths confined within people who are intentional combatants and who have signed up for this war, even though, of course, that's a complicated question in terms of who signs up for the war. You could say that it's voluntary, but very often it's compulsory, and sometimes for economic reasons. Uh, but unfortunately, the reality of modern warfare is that actually you are much more likely to die as a civilian than you are as a soldier, which is actually one of the major reasons why I oppose war overall, is that I think we have crossed the threshold where our weapons are so powerful that we can't even distinguish anymore. Um, and I did want to actually ground these remarks in an experience that I had when I was younger, which really cemented my path towards becoming an anti-war activist. My mother, God rest her soul, passed away in 1999, but she brought me here as an immigrant to this country all the way back in 1985, and she used to work at the United Nations. And all the way back in 1990, I followed her to the country that she was assigned to. And the country that she was assigned to was Rwanda in Africa. And I got to spend about a year and a half in Rwanda. And unfortunately, 1990 is when some of the fighting in Rwanda started that expanded into what unfortunately the world got to know as the Rwandan genocide a couple of years later. Uh, Now, to be clear, by the time I left Rwanda, and the only reason that I was able to leave and evacuate Rwanda was because I was the son of a diplomat. And so I was able to leave before the fighting really got, to those genocidal levels. Um, But all I did was, so I was a kid. I was 13 years old. I experienced all of about a week's worth of warfare, just about a week's worth. And clearly not as a combatant, just as a civilian. And I was largely inside the compound that we stayed in. And I just remember hearing, the machine gun fire, the tanks, all of that, and just being absolutely terrified. And I often tell people, this happened when I was 13 years old. I am 49 years old now. That memory has absolutely imprinted itself in me, and I believe genuinely that my nervous system was kind of permanently changed from that point on. I mean, there was a before and an after. Now, I experienced a week's worth of war in a relatively privileged place. I mean, I did see some awful things, but I didn't get to experience what a lot of my Rwandan friends, for example, experienced. And all of it lasted for a week. And to this day, I can immediately go back to that sense of fear, that sense of terror. And I remember one of the things that I kept thinking about at the time was um, how how unfair it was that as a civilian, I had basically didn't make any decision about the fighting, but that there were people who had more power than me, who had decided basically that my life was not as important as their political goals. And from that point on, I decided to become an anti-war activist. And thankfully, through the Syracuse Peace Council and other organizations, I have been able to do that. And the reason I'm starting with that story is because um, years later, um, right after the October 7th attacks in Israel. By then, I had already done a little bit of organizing. Well, not just a little bit. Actually, I'd started organizing on Palestine in the early 2000s. But by the time we got to October 7th and the attacks on Israel, I remember hearing about that attack. And at that time, I already understood the incredibly brutal calculus that comes with the fighting of the IDF, of the Israeli Defense Forces. And unfortunately, the kind of ratio that had already been accepted by the international order, which was largely that basically for every one Israeli person who even experienced discomfort, you could experience maybe, I don't know, 100 dead Palestinians. I mean, the disproportion is insane. And I'm relating that story specifically because once I understood the impact of that attack on Israel, I think that I spent the next 3 days in a kind of a panic mode. And that panic mode kind of reminded me of how I felt when I was 13 years old. And it was the strangest experience. I remember feeling like I was seeing visions of blood. Like I knew it was coming. I knew that we would be seeing um, killing on an industrial level. And certainly, along with many, many people, not just in the United States, but across the globe, and of course, in solidarity of Palestinian resistance itself, I did everything that I could with movement activists to basically stop the genocide before it could happen. And unfortunately, because of the power structures that were in place, we were not able to do so. And we now live in a globe where we've all basically the ones of us who've been paying attention, we've all had to watch a live stream genocide, a live stream genocide. And the thing that sort of drives me insane about that is that in earlier eras, at the very least, we didn't have the kind of technology that we have now that makes this kind of killing so immediate to us. But now, during this genocide, all of us, and I mean by all of us, I'm even very much including kids, could pick up, their phones, get on Instagram, get on TikTok, and TikTok was definitely banned because of censorship around the genocide. Um, we could all pick up this live stream genocide, watch people get slaughtered and ethnically cleansed, and then we would go back home and turn on the news and hear all sorts of excuses and justifications for this killing. Um, and I would like to suggest that this is not just, wrong ethically because of the genocide. It's also wrong in the sense that it gives you a sense of of the immense distance that we have now between the actions of our government and our ability to basically stop these actions. And also how far we have gone to already dehumanize an entire people. And one of the many things that sort of drives me insane, you're definitely going to hear me use this expression quite a bit. One of the many things that drives me insane about all of this is that um, we now live in a society where we have the capacity to see the victims of empire, but we do not have the direct capacity to stop these immense wars. Bringing it back to the present, for example, now we're in such a crisis of democracy in the United States, right? That when Trump launched his attack on Iran, which could very easily move the entire globe towards World War III in terms of all of the potential interconnections there that could make this crisis a global one. There wasn't even a debate in Congress about this. Now, to be clear, the debates that we have in Congress about these wars are very often rubber stamp debates. And one of the things that is, very tough about living in the United States in the belly of the beast of the empire is that the United States is an incredibly militaristic society.
That's our program for today. I'm Stanley Heller for the Struggle Video News.